I've never been there before. How was your snow day on Monday? Good. What did you do? You did build a snowman, Olivia?
That night I went to Snippet's castle. It was my birthday and I went to sledding.
Cool. Aiden? You went sledding? Fun. Okay, so since I have been here, I started coming here in about September, and you were reading Blizzard of the Blue Moon, and then we read A Good Night for Ghosts, and now you are finishing up your I Survived, and some of you are reading the, is it My American Girl stories? Are you all reading I Survived? Yeah. Okay, so what genre does our I Survived books come from? Olivia? Historical fiction. So you've been working with historical fiction, and historical fiction is based on historical events. It has a real setting, but it has a mix of real and imaginary people or things, right? So there's a mix of real, but also pretend. And I think that that's kind of confusing. Is that kind of confusing?
No.
No, you don't think so? Maybe a little bit?
Yeah.
I think it gets confusing sometimes when things are real, but also pretend. So today, I am going to teach you a comprehension strategy. Do you remember what a strategy is? Yes. Raise your hand if you know what a strategy is. David.
A way to solve something.
A way to solve something. Good. It's something that helps us. So we're going to talk about a comprehension strategy today that is going to help us when we read, help us become better readers, but especially when we read historical fiction. Okay? And this strategy is called questioning. Do you answer a lot of questions during the day? Yeah? Do you ask a lot of questions?
Yeah.
Yes? So questioning is something that we do naturally. When I say that it's something that we do naturally, I mean that it's something we do without thinking, right? We kind of wake up naturally, or we eat food naturally, or we walk naturally, right? At one point we had to learn how to walk, but eventually we just do it. Do you think about walking? No. So questioning is kind of the same thing. So you might, in your head, you might get up in the morning and you say, what am I going to wear today? Or Mrs. Langer might say, what do you want for lunch? Or you might ask each other, what are you doing after school, right? So we ask questions all the time. So that's really good, because when we're reading, we can ask questions as well, okay? So we're going to talk about 3 different kinds of questions today that are going to help us better understand what we're reading and figure out that mix of real and pretend, okay? So I have 3 types. The first type is before questions. What do you think a before question is? Okay, so she said that you say a question first and then later on you don't. Does anyone have any other ideas? Anna? Right, so Monday comes before Tuesday, right? So when I talk about before questioning, it is a question that you ask before you start reading, okay? So before you even open the cover of your book, you are asking questions about the story. And to ask those questions, we can use the title, right? And we can use what? The picture or the illustrations to ask questions. And since we only have the title and we only have the picture, we might only have a couple of questions. There are only so many things that we can ask based on the title and the pictures. Okay? So before questions are questions that we ask before we even what? Open the book. So those are the questions we want to know while we're reading. The next type of question is a during question. What do you think I mean when I say a during question?
That you're saying right now.
Right now? Okay, Olivia?
During when you're reading the book.
During, bingo, when you're reading the book. Okay? So, when I was doing before questions, I said you might only have what?
A few questions.
A few questions, right? But when you're reading the book, should you just have a few questions? No, you should have a lot of questions because there are a lot of pages and there's a lot of information inside the book, right? So that's when we are going to ask questions while we're reading. So we might read a page and a question might pop up into our head, okay? My next question, can anyone Anyone guess?
After.
After. So what do you think an after question is? Hayden, you ask the question after you're reading. Now sometimes you might not have any after questions, but a good reader would have a couple of questions at the end, okay? So before is before you even open the cover. During is
You ask questions
when you're still reading, and after is when you're done, okay? So now you might be thinking, oh my goodness, Miss Sloan, these questions, I'm going to have so many questions. How am I going to keep these straight in my head, right? So I have a trick that I'm going to teach you, and it uses sticky notes, okay? So we are going to use sticky notes to work on our questioning. Now what's really fun is that sticky notes stick to our pages, right? So for our before questions, we can just stick them right to the front of the book because before questions happen before we read, right? And the during questions, we can just stick. Let's say I have a question on this page. I could just stick it right here on the page, okay? And if we put it in the middle like this to make it like a bookmark, when we're reading, if we think, oh, I think my question was just answered, you can flip right back to the question and write down the answer, okay? In the after questions, we can just stick where? Right on the back because it's at the end of the book. Okay, so I am going to model this for you, okay? I'm going to read Henry's Freedom Box, and I am going to, did I lose my pencil? Oh, here it is. I am going to read Henry's Freedom Box, which is a historical fiction book, okay? And I'm going to model questioning for you. So I'm going to ask questions before, during, and after reading, okay? So what I want you to do is listen and watch as I ask the questions so that you know how to do this in a little bit when I split you up into groups to read other historical fiction books. Okay? Do you have any questions before I start? No? Okay. So,
Will we read the same book? Will we read the same book in our group?
nope, you're going to read a different book. I have a bunch of different books. So each group is going to read a different book. But we'll talk about that when I'm done reading, okay? Okay. Henry's Freedom Box. So I am going to think about a question that I could ask before I start reading. Henry's Freedom Box. I wonder if people keep things in a box. So I wonder what's inside of this box. So I'm going to write that question down. What is in his box? So I wrote that down. And I'm going to stick that right here. Okay, now I'm going to start reading. Henry Brown wasn't sure how old he was. Henry was a slave, and slaves weren't allowed to know their birthdays. Henry and his brothers and sisters worked in the big house where their master lived. What's a master? I think I'm going to write that question down. Maybe it will be answered later in my story. So what is a master? One morning, the master called for Henry and his mother. They climbed the wide staircase. The master lay in bed with only his head above the quilt. He was very ill. He beckoned them to come closer. Some slaves were freed by their owners. So I know about slavery, and I know that in this time the African Americans were the slaves of the white people. And it says that some slaves were freed by their owners. And it says that the master is laying in bed. So I think that the master must be the owner. So I'm going to flip back to my previous question, and I'm going to write the answer down, that he is the owner. Some slaves were freed by their owners. Henry's heart beat fast. Maybe the master would set him free. The The master said, "You are a good worker, Henry. I am giving you to my son. You must obey him and never tell a lie." Henry nodded, but he didn't say thank you. That would have been a lie. Later that day, Henry watched a bird soar high above the trees. "Free bird, happy bird," Henry thought. Henry said goodbye to his family. He looked across the field. The leaves swirled in the wind. Oh, that's really sad that he's leaving his family. I wonder if he's ever going to see them again. I'm going to write that question down. Will he see him again? I'm going to stick that right like a bookmark so that I can return to it if I answer the question in my reading. Henry worked in his new master's factory. He was good at his job. "Do not tear that tobacco leaf," the boss yelled at the new boy. He poked the boy with a stick. "If you made a mistake, the boss would beat you." From the pictures that I've seen, Henry looks pretty young, but he's working. I'm wondering why they're working at such a young age. I'm going to write that question down. Why is he working at such a young age? Write that down. Stick that like a bookmark. Henry was lonely. One day he met Nancy, who was shopping for her mistress. They walked and talked and agreed to meet again. Henry felt like singing, but slaves didn't dare sing in the streets. Instead, he hummed all the way home. Months later, Henry asked Nancy to be his wife. When both their masters agreed, Henry and Nancy were married. Soon there was a little baby, then another, and another. Henry knew they were very lucky. They lived together even though they had different masters. But Nancy was worried. Her master had lost a great deal of money. "I'm afraid he will sell our children," she said. Henry was very still. Henry worked hard all morning. He tried to forget what Nancy said. At lunchtime, Henry rushed to the center. His friend James came into the factory. He whispered to Henry, "Your wife and children were just sold at the slave market." "No," cried Henry. Henry couldn't move. He couldn't think. He couldn't work. "Twist that tobacco," the boss poked Henry. Henry twisted the tobacco leaves. His heart twisted in his chest. At lunchtime, Henry reached the center of town. A large group of slaves was tied together. The owner shouted at them. Henry looked for his family. "Father, father!" Henry watched his children disappear down the road. Where was Nancy? He saw her the same moment she saw him. When he wiped away the tears, Nancy too was gone. I'm wondering what will happen to his children. Will he see his children again? No. Henry no longer sang. He couldn't hum. He went to work at night. He ate supper and went to bed. Henry tried to think of happy times, but all he could see were the carts carrying away everyone he loved. Henry knew he would never see his family again. I just asked if he would see his family again, and that said that he won't. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to write no under that question because I know the answer. Many weeks passed. One morning, Henry heard singing. A little bird flew out of a tree into the open sky, and Henry thought about being free. But how? As he lifted a crate, he knew the answer. He asked James and Dr. Smith to help him. Dr. Smith was a white man who thought slavery was wrong. They met early the next day at an empty warehouse. Henry arrived at the box. I will mail myself to a place where there are no slaves, he said. James stared at the box, then at Henry. What if you cough and someone hears you? I will cover my mouth and hope, said Henry. I'm starting to figure out what that box is going to be. Dr. Smith wrote on the box, to William H. Johnson, Arch Street, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Henry would be delivered to friends in Philadelphia. Then he printed on the crate in big letters, this side up, with care. So I know that Henry is going to go in the box. So he doesn't keep his own things in the box, he is going to go in the box. So I went back to answer that question. Henry needed an excuse to stay home, or the work boss would think he had run off. James pointed to Henry's sore finger, but Henry knew it wasn't bad enough. He opened a bottle of oil of Vicryl. No, cried James. Henry poured it on his hand. It burned his skin to the bone. Now the boss would have to let him stay home. Dr. Smith bandaged Henry's hand. They arranged to meet the next morning at 4 o'clock. I'm wondering how desperate or how badly he wanted to be somewhere else away from slaves that he would hurt himself that bad. So I'm going to ask, why would he hurt himself that badly? He burnt his skin all the way to the bone. The sun was not yet up when Henry climbed into the box. Ready, he said. James nailed down the lid. Dr. Smith and James drove to the station. The railway clerk tipped the box over and nailed a paper to the bottom. Dr. Smith begged the clerks to be careful, but they didn't. But they didn't listen. They threw the box into the baggage car. Hours passed. Henry was lifted and thrown again. Upside down, he heard waves splashing. This must be the steamboat headed for Washington, D.C. The ship rode smoothly, but Henry was still upside down. Blood rushed to his head. His face got hot. His eyes ached. He thought his head would burst. But he was afraid to move. Someone might hear him. I'm tired of standing, someone said. Why don't we move that box and sit on it, said another. Henry held his breath. Could they be talking about his box? Henry was pushed. The box scraped the deck. Now he was on his right side. Now on his left, and suddenly, right side up. I'm wondering if Henry's gonna make it without getting caught. They're moving him around a lot. So is he going to make it? Will he make it? What do you think is in here, said the first man. Mail, I guess, said the other. I am mail, thought Henry, but not the kind that they imagined. Henry was carried off the steamboat and placed in a railroad car, this time head up. He fell asleep to the rattling song of the train wheels. He woke to a loud knocking. Henry, are you all right in there? All right, he answered. The cover was pried open. Henry stretched and stood up. Four men smiled at him. Welcome to Philadelphia. At last, Henry had a birthday. March 30th, 1849, his first day of freedom. And from that day on, he also had a middle name. Everyone called him Henry Fox Brown. Well, now I'm wondering if he does end up ever seeing his family, or I'm wondering what Henry's life will be like now that he's free. So what will life be like? So that's my after question. So did you see how I asked questions before I started reading and during reading? And then if I answered a question, what did I do? If I found the answer, what did I do? I went back, right, to answer the question. Okay? So it was really helpful that I had these sticky notes to mark the pages where my questions were so that I could go back to them. And it's really helpful that we write down the questions, because did you know that when you write something down, your brain is more likely to remember it? Did you know that? Yeah, so when we're writing these questions down, it is kind of like writing it into our brain so that we'll remember it. So when we write it down and we keep reading, we'll be able to return to it and be able to answer it. Okay? Do you have any questions about questioning? That's fine. Any questions about questioning? No? Okay, so we are going to head back to our tables in just a minute, okay? And we are going to work in groups. We're going to have 5 groups of about 4 people, maybe a little less, okay? And I'm going to give each of your groups a book. And you are going to work on questioning. So let's head back to our tables and I will explain a little bit more about that.